Well, thank you very much for agreeing to share some insights on the importance of Hegel in the history of philosophy. A very important figure, but a very difficult figure. And so we're looking forward in class to exploring Hegel. But as I say, thanks for helping us to do that.
It's a delight to be here.
Thanks. I wonder if we could just start by exploring why, in a sense, what motivated you to want to study Hegel so much for so many years. What was it that kind of caught your interest? It's so helpful to have a little hook to interest ourselves in a philosopher. So can you share what hooked you?
Yeah, well, when I wanted to do a doctorate, I went to one of my undergraduate teachers who had been quite inspiring, and who had been working on a book on the philosophy of religion from Kant to Kierkegaard. And he drew my attention to a passage from a German thinker named Gottfried Lessing, in which he's commenting on a passage from Origen, where Origen said that the evidence for Christianity lay in the prodigious miracles, which proved that, which was evidence for the truth of Christianity. And Lessing said, well, I have a bit of a problem with this because when you have historical events like a resurrection and the response of the believers to the resurrection, those are things which, when they're reported, I'm quite prepared to believe them. But the evidence for them is simply the stories, and the stories could be wrong, and they could be, there's all kinds of questions about the reliability of the stories of historical events. And to try and claim that that is evidence for eternal and metaphysical and moral truths, which are holding all throughout, that's quite a different kind of thing it's doing. So he said, I've got on the one hand these historical truths, which are certainly we believe and we can do quite a lot with, but then on the other hand, you've got these metaphysical and moral truths, which are to decide whether you live or die, and he said there's a nasty broad ditch between these two things, and I can't get over that bridge. No matter how hard or how seriously I try to leap. And so my professor said to me, well, why don't you take that leap is what Kierkegaard talked about when he talked about the leap of faith. He is actually explicitly referring to Lessing's passage. So why don't you look at how Kant, Schleiermacher, Schelling, and Hegel responded to Lessing's ditch. So that was my thesis. By the time I got writing it, I had collapsed into just two people I looked at, Hegel and Schelling, and I became quite convinced that Hegel had a much more interesting and plausible way of bridging the gap between the two than Schelling did. So that's where it was.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Well, that feeds very nicely into where we are in our course, because we've looked at Kant, and each student has also now done a little piece on either Fichte or Schelling, and as a preparation for Hegel. So maybe you could help us to understand how Hegel's philosophy emerges out of the background of Kant.
Okay, well, Kant, of course, the big thing in Kant is his critique of pure reason, where he's trying to establish how we know things, and in particular, how we know that every cause, everything that happens is caused. Everything has a cause, which is not something that would naturally come from our experience. And he does that by appealing to he tries to establish it by basing it on the way we conceive, the way we understand the things we sense. And that was called the transcendental philosophy, because it was looking at the transcendental way we think, we know, which is establishing the criteria by which we know the things of the world, particularly things like cause. And he also suggested the mathematical truths as well. Kant did that simply by starting from the fact that we do know things about the world and then trying to analyze it out. Fichte came along and said, well, that's a little bit arbitrary because that's just assuming where you are. You've got to establish it from first principles. So he developed in his science of knowledge he established a kind of way of moving from a very basic need to think and act at the same time to other stages, which basically established all the categories which Kant had drawn. Kant had drawn them from the judgments that were present in the logic of his day. The problem with both Kant and Fichte was that they were doing it based on the way people think. They're grounding it in our ability to think and grasp things and understand the world. But that still leaves the world a little bit up there. Is the world really like that or not? And Schelling came along and said, well, you've got that. He really followed Fichte. He was the next great hero in the Kantian philosophy. He said, well, we do have the transcendental philosophy, but then on the other side, there's a philosophy of nature. And if we look at nature and understand it, it has certain structures. And then he eventually wants to suggest that those two fit together as contrary sides. But well, Hegel had been an older friend of Schelling at the seminary, the Lutheran seminary in Tübingen, where they'd been students. And he ended up working with Schelling when Hegel got his father died and he got an inheritance so he could go back to university. And the university he went to was where Schelling was. And they started working together, and he sort of followed along in Schelling's ideas. But Hegel, as he was doing it, began to get puzzled. He said, well, what we've got are a whole bunch of philosophers, each one claiming that they know what the truth is. And how do we really establish, how do we really establish the fact that we really know? You can simply claim that what you're saying is knowledge, but that claim is no good than anybody else's claim. And he said, well, can I find a way of resolving that? And he did that. He wrote a book which is almost unique in the philosophical literature. And it's a book called The Phenomenology. And the ploy he suggested, which I find very convincing actually, is introduced in what is called the introduction. He says, you can't really simply start from saying this is the knowledge and I can now show everything and it all makes all kinds of sense and things. Every knowledge claim is claiming of the truth. And if you're certain of the truth, then what we need to do is simply take knowledge claims, which are certain, put them into practice and see what happens when you try to know things and seeing whether you end up with things the way that you thought it was. And if you find out that what you're certain of is not true, then you haven't got a knowledge claim. You've got to go on to another one. And so the phenomenology is a path of tracing a whole lot of knowledge claims and tracing the experience that comes when you put them into practice, and then seeing that in fact what they're claiming isn't what actually turns out to happen. And that then leads on to another one, and each one. And what's significant about it, what's basically Hegelian, is that that sequence of knowledge claims develop a linear sequence of moving from one to another, each one building on what has been learned from the failure of the previous one. So probably it's best to go on, I presume, to suggest how that works.
That's very, very interesting. You know, it leads me just to reflect on a kind of parallel with the structure of a Platonic dialogue. Do you think there's a parallel there at all? Where you try something and try again?
Yeah, well, that's quite right. If you think of Euthyphro, for example, where Euthyphro keeps presenting definitions of piety and each one doesn't work, it's very similar to a Platonic dialogue.
And to what extent would Hegel then feel that he is able to reach a resting point at the end of this journey?
Well, let me suggest a couple of the early stages, and then I'll try and suggest how it ends.
Okay.
Okay. The first one he starts with is, in a sense, it's a little bit like Hume, but even more radical than Hume. Hume says that you start with impressions, but the impressions are already formed a little bit into certain kinds of things. Hegel says, let's take the position which says it's simply what you're sensing, what you're seeing, and what you're hearing. That's what's true. And he says, okay, let's start out. What's true now? Well, now it's daytime and I'm looking at a computer. But 5 hours from now, you say, what's true now? And you say, or maybe a little longer, it's nighttime. And in fact, I'm climbing into bed. I'm seeing a room around me where I'm climbing a bed where I'm going. So what's true has turned out to be not true. Well, that seems to be a problem. So then to keep to that sense of being immediate, where you're not doing any thinking at all, where you're not trying to do anything that's thinking, you've got to go somewhere else. So the response that Hegel suggests is, well, it's my sensing that's important. It's not what I'm seeing, but my sensing that's important. But then it's your sensing. There's your sensings, and there's a whole lot of people sensing. So which one of those is true? Because truth is something which everybody should agree on. Well, then the response is, we'll point. And by pointing, we won't even say it's I or it's that. It's simply the act of pointing which is involved. And he says, well, look at that. Let's look at it closely. When pointing, you're saying, well, I'm looking at this tree, and then I'm not looking at the tree, but I'm looking at the tree again, but in a slightly different angle. And then I'm looking at the tree again. And what's happening as time progresses, your mind is constantly reconstructing a continuum that builds on the various sequence of things. So rather than having that immediate sense of truth, which is simply without any thinking at all, you've got to be thinking to be able to weave those various moments together. And that then becomes a basis for, rather than relying on the immediate moment of sensing, you're looking at the things you are perceiving, the colors that last over time, the shapes, the objects, the sounds, and so on. So that then leads into his next stage, which is called perception. And he does a similar kind of ploy with that. So that's a very simple kind of way. A second, but then he says that develops on its own way. But then he says, but this all is an effort to get at the things in the world, but we're actually doing a lot of thinking to get there. Who are we? What am I? So there's a question of who am I as a thinking being? And you start out by saying, well, basically what I am is what I desire. I know who I am when I desire things, and when I find something and I see a nice cake and I eat it up, I get a real sense of how good I am. But the trouble is that it's great for the time I'm eating the cake, but once the cake's done and I'm full, I don't desire anymore. So I desire something else. So you're keeping on desiring new things, but you don't get any real long-term knowledge of yourself because it's constantly changing. But then all of a sudden you run across somebody else who also desires things. And you turn out to desire the same thing. So you get into a struggle and you say, I want that thing. And you get a struggle which ends up with one of us dying. The victor kills the other. But that isn't very successful because as soon as you've done that, you're back where you started from. One person can't do it at all. And the other person is back simply desiring things and hasn't moved anywhere. But so the next time you get into a fight, or next time if you've seen somebody else in a fight where it ended up that way, you say, okay, well, it's probably not a good thing to fight right to the death. It's better to sort of, if I'm losing, it's better for me to simply say uncle and give in than to try and keep on fighting and then end up not being around at all. So then I become a slave, and the other person becomes my master. And the master is able to enjoy the great things of the world, but he doesn't have to struggle with them anymore because he can tell the slave to do all the struggling with the things, to make the cakes and build the houses and do all the things he wants to enjoy. So the master really thinks he knows who he is because he's in charge of things and he's telling the slave what to do. And the slave's there struggling away, doing whatever the master wants him to do. And so that looks fairly good, except that once you start thinking about it, it's not quite as simple as it is, because it turns out the master isn't all that independent after all. Because the only way he can continue to be master is by depending on the slave to do all the things for him. And the slave, on the other hand, turns out when people do things, bake a cake and then eat it, that they're then satisfied. But for the slave, he bakes a beautiful cake, and then he looks at it and he says, you know what? That beautiful structure is me. It's all the things I put into it, but I can't eat it. It's there for someone else. And he begins to realize that he has developed a sense of who he is by seeing what he is in that thing that he has created. So the slave, in fact, comes to value his own identity in a way that the master couldn't do. So that then leads on, interestingly enough, says Hegel, into the Stoics. So it's a nice play because the Stoics, of course, there's the master, Marcus Aurelius, the Caesar, the emperor of the world, and then there's Epictetus, who's a slave. And both of them take a very similar approach. So I'll leave that one there. That's the second one. Now, to your big question, what's the final solution? The last chapter in the Phenomenology is called Absolute Knowing. And a lot of people think that it's somehow knowing everything. And they base that, I think, a little bit on that introduction I said. It's being certain you know the truth. Because that was his definition of truth, of knowledge, was being certain and you're knowing the truth. Well, it's a very difficult chapter. Life was getting difficult for Hegel as this was going on because Napoleon was fighting wars right outside his town. And he had to write quickly, so he wrote this final chapter, which is very difficult. But there are two preceding stages which he refers to, and he suggests that they come together somehow in that final chapter. The one stage is the result of the first 6 chapters of his book, which is in a sense the culmination of our normal human experience. And it's found in a person who has developed a firm conscience, not simply a conscience, because conscience can quite often push you in ways which are necessary, but who simply see and who have developed sufficient knowledge and experience of the world to see what they ought to do. And they do. But then they're part of a community, and somebody else who is similarly part of that world, looks at what that person does and says, well, it's not all that great. Look at this. There's these kinds of things. So the second person becomes a judge who points out that what they thought was good has all kinds of problems with it. And so the judge condemns the beautiful soul, as he's called. And the beautiful soul at first sort of says, no, I was quite certain that I had done what was right. But then he looks at it looks more closely at what he did and realized, well, there are lots of things wrong with that. And the judge, on the other hand, begins to realize that by being such a harsh and unforgiving judge, he is himself doing things which is wrong. And so the two become reconciled. Now, it seems to me there are many different that picked up in some. I have a friend who says that that's caught him in literature by a novelist who lived at the same time. But I think that sort of captures part of the Lutheran tradition. Hegel was trained in a Lutheran seminary, but when Luther created the Lutheran Church, he rejected 4 of the 7 sacraments. He kept baptism and the Eucharist, of course, but he also kept confession. And the pattern of the beautiful soul, it seems to me, represents the structure of confession, where the person who is committed and is a firm, has an insight into how one ought to acts, and then realizes that in that action they've done things wrong. That is then condemned by the person they are confessing to, but then there is a reconciliation that results from it. So I think that that's one-sided, but that's only one half of it, because that's tracing the development of human experience. It doesn't tell you what's the ultimate truth of the world itself. And at this point, Hegel then has his 7th chapter, where he talks about religion and the knowledge claims of religion. And the culmination of that is revealed religion. And he says, in revealed religion, the tradition passes down, and he talks about how it tells the story of a creation. The world is created. When the creation has happened, God realizes that the creation didn't turn out to be as good as he thought, so he condemns, and then finds a way through, condemns the world in the flood, for example, and then finds a way through by having someone like Noah survive and the world redevelop. But then that still doesn't work, because the world keeps on going bad and the world becomes evil. So God becomes a man and becomes part of the world. So God is a man, but the culmination of that comes at the point where God isn't able to really change it. God's put to death. and that there's a Lutheran hymn which nowadays it says God's Son lies dead, but originally it said God himself lies dead. On the cross, he has died. He has been put to death. Well, on the other, that then triggers in the believer a dynamic, because, and this is the dynamic that Hegel traces, the believer, in seeing that God dies, realizes that the God he'd been relying on, who will save him from all these problems, isn't there. Has an experience of the death of God, which it strikes me is picking up the themes that you can find in St. John of the Cross, of the dark night of the soul, when you go to the places where God has been and he's not there anymore. And out of that, on both the result of that double dynamic is a life lived realizing that the whole dynamic of life, it's not these projections outside, but the life as we now live it is lived in the Spirit. And it's in the Spirit, which is the ultimate dynamic that grounds the universe and grounds human life. So what Hegel then says, oh, okay, you've got that lived experience of reconciliation in the beautiful soul. You've got this picture of the cosmos, the world itself is governed by a cosmic process which involves the same process of developing one's experience, knowing what one's doing it, realizing that you've made a mistake and things have gone wrong, taking account of that and recovering it and going on. So in fact, absolute knowing is the process Hegel has sketched in his original introduction as the process of being confident and certain of what you're doing, putting it into practice, realizing it's not what you expected, and learning from that. Okay.
Thank you.
Question?
Well, that's a great introduction to the phenomenology, which is something we want to particularly, I think, focus on in our course. Would you be able to say anything at all about how that would lead on to Hegel's later work, maybe the logic? What does Hegel mean by logic?
Of course, that's part of Lessing's problem. It's not simply, he's comparing the things of history against the things which can be demonstrated, and logic is the process of demonstration. But again, Hegel writes, his logic doesn't look like a normal logic book. In fact, I spent most of my life working on his logic. Not most of my life, but that's where I think if I did anything interesting, that's where it is. Hegel, when he comes, let me go back to the end of the phenomenology. Once he has achieved the phenomenon, that realization that it's the way we think has been shaped by that whole realm of experience, which has shaped our development, that is based in the phenomenology. So we've included everything that not only we, but also our past, our culture has learned and discovered about the world. And then we simply start to think and try to think out the ways we think about that world, the concepts and ideas. And like Fichte, he wants to do it systematically. He did that in the phenomenology by going from one stage to the next stage, and so on. But how do you do that with the logic? So he says it's really how we move from idea. Thinking involves moving from ideas or concepts to ideas or concepts. Now, if you're going to do that, where do you start? You start, any idea has some kind of determinate character. That means that you're already well along on the way. If you're going to start, you've got to start from something which is completely indeterminate. And what is the thought about something that is completely indeterminate? That would be pure being. It's whenever we use the word just something is, we can use that for anything that we want. We can say that there are unicorns in history, or people thought there are unicorns that we're thinking about. There are unicorns. There are all kinds of strange things that we can think about. Everything we think about is, in a way, it's not existing in the world, but that's already a determinate sense of is. We're wanting to talk about something which simply is something we can think about. And all these things are things we can think about. So the word is completely indeterminate. It doesn't tell you anything about what you're saying about. So that's where we start. When you start thinking about that pure being, what are you thinking? You're not thinking anything. You're thinking nothing. Oh, we wanted to think about being, but now we're thinking nothing. Well, let's think about nothing. Nothing is pure indeterminacy, but it's something we're thinking about. So it's just the same as being. So when we start thinking being, we end up with nothing. When we start thinking nothing, we end up with being. They're the same thing. But they're not the same thing because we moved from one to the other. And that movement was significant. That's a movement which we call, when we move from something to another, it's not being, but a becoming. Something is becoming something else. Well, so we've got a new thought. We started out with being, we moved to nothing. Now we've got a new thought, which is becoming. The thought of becoming, things become. But there are two kinds of becoming. If we start with being, we end up with nothing. That's a passing away. If we start out with nothing, we end up with being, which is a coming to be. Now, if we take those two ways, being, passing away into nothing, nothing coming to be into being, you've got a circle. It just keeps on moving in a circle. Well, but that circle collapses into the thought of a being which it comes to be and passes away. And the word that Hegel uses for that is a German word called Dasein, and there's no English word that matches it. But if you think of the difference between pure being and a being, an a being is something which comes to be and passes away. So that's a way of doing it. Quite often that word Dasein is translated as determinate being or something of that sort. So it's a different thing. But that process of starting with an idea, moving to its contrary, because to get clear if you want to know what possibility is, for example, you've got to know what actuality is. And to know what actuality is, you have to know what possibility is. Well, it's that movement from possibility to actuality is what we call necessity, but it also applies to what we call contingency, and so on. So Hegel does that with a lot of he takes every concept and shows how when you're thinking through what it actually means, it moves from one term to another. The trouble is he writes it in very abstract language, and it's very hard to understand. You can spend a lifetime working out those passages.
I think we're very fortunate that we've been able to tap into your lifetime of study to explore some of these themes. I'm very, very grateful to you for helping to introduce us to Hegel and some of these very important ideas. One thing that was just striking me just now, thinking about Hegel's different approach to logic to other philosophers, is that it is very much rooted in how we actually think, in a way that so many philosophers' approach to logic isn't. It's kind of, I mean, someone like Leibniz, who's very kind of mathematical in his logic, that isn't the way we actually think, arguably. So that's a very interesting aspect to it as well. But thank you very much indeed for sharing those ideas with us today, and wish us luck as we try to get a grasp on Hegel for our course. Thank you very much again.
Very well. Thank you very much for having me.